This video is brought to you by Straight Goods News, Canada's alternative online news source. Visit straightgoods.ca.
The session was marked by the adoption of a senseless and unfair Conservative budget which undermines our environment and penalizes seniors and the unemployed. We showed that New Democrats can do things differently. The session was also marked by numerous ethical and public administration failures. I'm thinking of the F-35s and spending abuses of certain cabinet ministers, $23,000 limo rides for the Prime Minister in Davos, Switzerland, Peter MacKay, the minister who used a search and rescue helicopter to impress his buddies and then tried to cover up the whole story. The same minister who spent $47,000 of taxpayers' money to bring a fake F-35 for a photo op to announce Canada was buying these planes, only to deny later that a decision had been made. No government has shut down debate more than the Harper Conservative government. It's unprecedented. A record number of closures and time allocations. Time and time again, the Conservatives prevented members of Parliament from doing the job they were sent here to do, properly study the bills the government brought. We know that the Conservatives are already affected by scandals and they're shamelessly cutting services to Canadians. That we've made clear. We will continue not only to oppose the Conservatives' backwards ideas, but also to put forward solutions. This summer, we will continue to listen to Canadians and be ready in the fall to keep the Conservatives' feet to the fire. So we will continue to work hard, as our objective remains to replace the Conservatives in 2000.
A totally different tack with this one. Sir, we've been over to Stornoway. You were telling us at the barbecue that you've tried to go to every part of the country since becoming leader. Yeah. You know, this is the last day for us to wear our ties at work. Will you be taking off a tie? Will you be getting on a bus like Mr. Ignatieff? What are your summer plans? Where will you be?
Catherine and I will be doing summer events that you've probably seen political leaders at before, so don't be surprised to see us at the Calgary Stampede as much as we'll be in the Tintamarre in Caraquette, and we'll also be going to Pride Parades in Montreal and in Toronto. We'll be doing several Canada Day events. That's the type of thing that we're going to be doing over the summer. We will be getting out and meeting Canadians, but it's something that we've continued to do since my election at the end of March. I have already been to every province, and some of them several times. Tomorrow I'm back off to Saskatchewan again, so it's something that we're going to continue to do.
Hi. You have managed to raise a lot of attention about the fact that the Conservatives were putting so much into C-38, but had they split it or had they not gone with such a huge omnibus to begin with, then probably the next year and a bit would be consumed with studying all these things, between environmental changes and all that at committee. So going beyond the Conservatives are so bad for putting all this in one, and that sort of message you brought across. What are you planning to do to make sure that Canadians understand, the sort of detailed policy changes that are coming through, and that sort of doesn't disappear in the fall when the next, idea or scandal comes up? I'm
going to let Nathan complete it on the process, but I would like to say that a lot of the changes that we're talking about are going to be topics that we will all be addressing together in the next election campaign. The $31 billion cut that I described, that Mr. Flaherty announced with no discussion, no debate, and no negotiation in December when he met the provincial finance ministers, that doesn't come into force until 2016. So that will be the object of a serious debate in the next election campaign. The changes to old age security would only come in after the next election, and so on. So there are a lot of the things that they've talked about. The EI changes only come in next year. So a lot of the things that they've talked about are going to be the object of a lot of public attention, discussion, and debate, not only in the coming years, but of course in the next election campaign as well. Go ahead on that.
We had a number of objectives at the beginning of the process around C-38. It seemed like its passage was inevitable, and also the fact that the government was unwilling to concede a single point on the budget. Our objectives were, as you said, to have Canadians understand completely what was in this, and that was no small task. As you know, the budget was enormous, affecting so many different parts of Canadian life. You also see region by region different issues come to the top. You may be employment insurance cuts in one region, or old age security in another, the environment in a third. So Canadians, once made aware of what's actually in the budget, then responded back to us in all the consultations that we had as to where their concerns lay. What happens next for us is continuing the effort of breaking this out of the Ottawa bubble and having people understand what those impacts will be, as Tom said, in the coming months and years. What's unusual about this piece of legislation is that it's not just affecting this one fiscal cycle. This is an effort by the government to fundamentally change the country for as long as a generation or more. So our fight goes out into the regions. One small comment. The spontaneity and the ownership Canadians took with this process was breathtaking. We had over 50 self-organized community forums across the country of people saying they wanted to put on their own conversations in their own communities, their own town halls. This is quite refreshing, particularly when you're dealing with a government like the Conservatives every day who want to suppress conversation, who want to take Canadians out of the picture. Canadians were forcing their way back in. And we could see it with Conservative after Conservative coming forward, which is unusual for this government, criticizing the budget, beginning to feel that pressure from their own constituents. That'll be the battle that goes on, because when these implications come down the road and more pipelines leak oil, people are refused their employment insurance, and people fully realize the impact on their health care services, Canadians will want to respond and hold these guys to it.
Bruce Tito.
Mr. Mulcair, we just came from a end of sitting news conference with Peter Van Loan where his constant refrain was, we got the job done. And he compared that to political paralysis in other parts of the world. Can I just hear your observations on that argument, getting the job done versus paralysis?
I'm not going to repeat their frame, but what I will tell you is this. We have a government that got elected on a promise to create jobs. That was going to be their #1 mandate. We know that we've lost 650,000 good-paying manufacturing jobs in Canada over the last 8 years. We have a less flexible, less diverse economy. That's one of the results of their choices. Instead of concentrating on job creation, they're going after government services. You and I both know that the whole pyramid of public administration exists to do one thing, finally, which is to deliver a service to the public. That's the last thing you should be going after. When you chop things like $50 million in food inspection, you're chopping a direct service to the public in an area where Canada has seen what the results can be if you don't do it properly. We had more than 20 people die in this country, one of the most advanced countries in the world, of listeriosis a few years ago. The minister told lame jokes about death of 1,000 cold cuts, and he's still the minister. That says a lot about what they consider their priorities. So if their priority was job creation, we wouldn't have the same high level of unemployment that we still have now. They can talk all they want about net new jobs. The fact of the matter is hundreds of thousands of good-paying manufacturing jobs are being replaced largely by part-time, precarious work in the service sector with no pension. That's another debt we're leaving to future generations. We have a different view of things. We think that our generation should assume its debts to clean up the air, the soil, and the water from large sites like the oil sand production, which is something we're not doing now. We think that federal legislation should be enforced. Basic principles of sustainable development like polluter pay have to be enforced. Federal legislation is not being enforced in a lot of these areas. Instead of changing the practices to make them correspond to the law, the Conservatives are changing the law to make them correspond to the practices. Another fundamental difference between us. And I'll end by saying, Bruce, that this notion that somehow Canada is an island, that we're not connected to what's going on in the rest of the world, it reminds me of nothing more than Jim Flaherty's statement in the fall of 2008 that if there was going to be a recession in this country, we'd already have one. And a few weeks later, we were in the worst recession since the 1920s. So I don't pay a lot of attention to the Conservative self-congratulatory end-of-year conference. What they tried to do is to fly under the radar with a budget bill that had nothing to do with the budget, that had everything to do with gutting environmental protections in this country, making people work 2 more years to get their old age security, hurting regions of this country that depend on temporary work and seasonal work so people can't get their EI anymore. We know that that's what was in their Trojan horse budget bill. We did our job of exposing that to the Canadian public. They're facing a strong, serious, structured official opposition for the first time. We're taking a fight to them like they've never seen before.
Let me follow up with the question that Peter Van Loan neglected to take from me, which was if these are...
I'll be glad to take it.
These are, well, it's a free shot for you because they declined to answer. If these are valuable, needed, long-term economic reforms for the country, why not take the time to do them properly?
Your question goes right to the heart of the whole debate for the past 3 months in the House. The Conservatives don't respect the very parliamentary institutions that should be the object of their greatest attention if they are indeed a law and order government. The laws come out of Parliament. Order peace, order, and good government as a result of respect of those parliamentary institutions. It's unprecedented in the history of the Canadian Parliament to use closure systematically. It's unprecedented in the history of the Canadian Parliament not to allow members of Parliament to express themselves on a budget bill. If the time spent on the voting had been spent in parliamentary committee on the 7 sections we told them should be studied separately, we would have been able to have a proper full study. But such is their disdain for parliamentary institutions that they would prefer to run roughshod, use their majority to ram these things through. We think that we got a good result by making Canadians realize what was in there. We put a nice big chalk circle around the stain. People were able to see what they were trying to get through under the radar in this budget bill, and I think that for us it's mission accomplished.
I'm sorry. Ish Teilheimer, Straight Goods.
Oh, go ahead, please.
For Mr. Mulcair, Nathan Cullen mentioned that the budget bill was intended to make changes that would affect the whole generation. And we've seen in the years since the Conservatives got their majority government, a number of fundamental changes have been made. The question is, what are the changes that concern you most that the Conservatives have made, and what do you think they're going to try to do in the next 3 years?
The part that concerns me the most is the loss of environmental protections in this country. This is something that's going to affect us long term. Just look at one example of the cleanup that another generation left ours, what are called the Sydney tar ponds in Nova Scotia. It's a $500 to $600 million cleanup. Obamo, that'll be the minimum cost. It's a site that a couple of dozen hectares. The sites that we're talking about with some of the current development in Canada that are being left to future generations are 1,000 times that large. So if we don't internalize costs, apply basic principles of sustainable development like pollute or pay, we're going to be leaving a huge debt to future generations. We already know that a whole series of federal laws were not being enforced by this federal government. The Fisheries Act, the Navigable Waters Act, the Migratory Birds Act, the Species at Risk, the federal obligation to take care of First Nations and cumulative health effects, so on. So these are all things, you know, as the pollution navigates inexorably through a massive ecosystem in certain areas of Canada, there's going to be a huge debt left to future generations. Gutting those environmental protections and those laws, which they weren't even enforcing, is going to leave a huge problem for future generations, and one that will never be forgiven, our generation. That's why we keep raising this, because we're leaving an environmental, economic, and social debt in the backpacks of future generations. It's a huge debt, and we're trying to make sure that people understand that, especially young people. 18 to 25-year-olds stayed home in the last election. 65% of them didn't bother to vote. We'll make sure they get the message and they come out and vote in the next election.
And what do you think is coming in the next 3 years?
Well, these attacks on environmental legislation didn't start with this budget bill. They started in 2009 when John Baird called this was the Minister of the Environment at the time. He called the Navigable Waters Act, which was a 100-year-old piece of legislation, a model in the world, by the way. He called it the greatest job killer. That's what they've always tried to do. It's a very passéist view of opposing environment and economy. So they attacked that in 2009 with the culpable complicity of the Liberals. They managed to gut the Navigable Waters Act. They're completing the job now. In 2010, they went after environmental assessments for large-scale energy projects in Canada. They sent them over to the National Energy Board, which had neither expertise nor experience to handle them. This time, they're completing it with the list that I gave you before, but they went so far as to say, oh, and by the way, even though we're going to go from about 6,000 environmental assessments a year to a couple of dozen, even there, if they tell us that something shouldn't go through, the minister can change the decision. That's what the Conservatives are doing. They sometimes make the mistake, they no longer talk about the environmental assessment process, they call it the environmental approval process. So basically it's an obligation of result. They betray themselves when they make that linguistic mistake. Constitute a nation within a united Canada. They've failed. Everything that they do with regard to Quebec is totally ham-fisted, and it simply illustrates the fact that they're no longer players. They don't get it. So we'll continue to bring a very positive message for all of Canada in terms of sustainable development, a very positive message for all of Canada in terms of how we can and should continue to work together. You know, I didn't learn about dealing with the sovereigntist issue watching TV with my remote control on my couch in my basement. I was in the front row and in the front trenches. I was there for the 1980 referendum. I was there for the 1995 referendum. I understand these issues and I know what it's about, and I know how divisive it can be. So the last thing I want to see is having those issues come to the fore again, either through a party reappearing here in Ottawa or in Quebec. I'm going to make sure that we do everything we can to send a very positive message about Quebec's place and role within Canada, and try to give real content and meaning to the recognition that the Québécois constitute a nation within a united Canada. That's one of my prime goals in what I'm trying to accomplish here as leader of the NDP.